Hi everyone, this is Daniel Azzopardi here, and this is the first of what I hope will be a series of conversations that I'll be having with a number of guests covering all topics political, economic, cultural, and social that are going on in the world today. To be perfectly honest, this is something of an experiment, and I'm not really sure how this is going to play out, but stick around and hopefully this will turn into something interesting. The first topic up for discussion today is Malta's controversial citizenship program. This was brought about in 2014 by the Maltese Labour government and has been pretty controversial since the day it was introduced, both by European institutions as well as the local media, not to mention, of course, the public at large. There have obviously been benefits to the program, but it has also been criticized for helping to further degrade Malta's reputation on an international level. To help me with this conversation is somebody who's a lot more well versed in the topic than I am. It's somebody who's actually quite intimately connected with the program. His name is Luke Frendo, and he's a managing partner at Frendo Advisory, which is a boutique law firm that provides legal advice to family offices and high net worth individuals. And as you can imagine, the citizenship program is very much wrapped in that. And he has been involved in pitching and selling the program to his clients pretty much since the inception of the program in 2014. The timing of this interview is quite timely, given that the Maltese government is actually restructuring the program from this September onwards, moving away from an over-the-counter passport selling system to more of a residency-based program. I think the topic remains a controversial one, and the purpose of this interview is hopefully to shed a bit more light on the background to the program, what the pros and cons are, and hopefully through listening to this, you can get a better picture of whether this is actually something that you'd want to support or not. I hope you enjoy the interview. One small caveat before actually going to the interview. This was recorded over a video call, and therefore there might be some jumpiness and some background noise, so apologies in advance for that. But without any further ado, I give you Luke Frendo. So welcome everybody, and welcome Luke. Thank you for coming onto the show. Good to see you again.
Hey Dan, good to see you virtually.
Very good to have you on. Luke is an old friend of mine from law school, actually, and we've remained friends since, gone on to a number of different ventures in different directions. But Luke is deeply involved in Maltese society, gets involved in a lot of good causes. I saw recently that you got involved in this campaign for Lasana, which was really interesting to see, really cool to have that kind of voice on the ground. Sometimes I feel as though we live in a country and in a world where politics and politicians tend to dominate all of the headlines, and there isn't much of a voice for the kind of social community in a country, and that's particularly true of Malta, I think. And it's good to see people taking initiatives, grassroots level, to push certain agendas and to make people aware that it's not just the voice coming from the two political parties that needs to be heard. And in particular, something like the initiative of Lasana is something that you would never see a politician or a political party really push, and it's something that has to come from the grassroots level. It just sometimes feels like it's a bit too difficult. It feels like you're always kind of swimming against the current doing these sorts of things in Malta.
Yeah, I mean, when this incident happened, which was last year, where a black member of the Maltese community was shot in cold blood, and two members of the Maltese Armed Forces are being prosecuted for the offense, I really felt that the public outlash was nowhere near as vocal as it should have been. And I think that became all the more clear after the George Floyd incident in the US, where it almost seemed like there was more of a public outcry amongst the Maltese community for George Floyd than there was for a very, very similar incident that happened in our own backyard. And obviously, I think people are entirely justified in being outraged about what happened in the US. but I thought it was a little bit hypocritical for us to have been largely silent about something that happened very similar right here. And the initial idea was to raise funds to make sure that Lasana and the three other victims who he was walking with on that day had proper legal representation, because obviously the alleged perpetrators hired the best lawyers in the country and had the best legal defense, and the victims of this crime had no legal representation whatsoever, which I think is an injustice on top of an injustice. And so the initial idea was to fund that legal defense, but Joe Giglio, who was a top Maltese criminal lawyer, offered to do that pro bono, which allowed for all the funds to be raised for the family of Lasana, his children and family in the Ivory Coast. And over 4 days, we raised 12,000 euros, which is a really strong message, I think. It was really nice. I think that it was made up of contributions from a large number of people, 400 people. At some point early on, I thought we might need to give it a push by reaching out to corporates, but we didn't need that. And I think that was actually a really nice message, along with the actual, money raised, which would be life-changing for his family.
Yeah, it's. I think it's quite telling of the time that while something that was so tragic happened in Malta, it's almost lost its resonance in the noise of the time that we're living in right now. It seems almost as though we've become more immune to the news coming out of Malta today. It just seems like over the last 2-3 years, it's just been one story after another that has really cemented a view, both locally and also from an international perspective, that Malta has just become, well, really it's a shadow of the kind of country with the sort of principles and values that we would all hope that we would want to be associated with in the country. It seems like all of it has fallen away recently, and we've almost become inoculated against any of this news and sort of want to move on to the next headline. We know that the news cycle has become shorter, but even so, it feels like there's no end in sight to the kind of negativity and the news coming out of the country in relation to both from a political, socio-economic framework. It just doesn't seem like there's any good stuff coming out of Malta today.
Yeah, I can appreciate how it feels like that and how it appears like that. But also, I think there have been some really big changes that came about as a result of movements from the bottom up. Like, I mean, a government that seemed impossible to topple regardless of what allegations came out resigned almost en masse just a number of weeks after people in relatively large numbers decided to hit the streets. And that was big change, big steps forward and progress that I think civil society in general deserves to take credit for. Obviously, even since then, a number of new allegations have come about, and it does seem like there's no end to them, and people have become somewhat immune to news which in a normal situation would have everyone out on the streets within hours. But I think there were a couple of big successes, and I think the politicians know that they can't run roughshod over everyone, and that there is this underlying sentiment of not accepting, the institutional degradation that is coming across through media houses and through allegations made in court, and the ongoing investigations into the murder of Daphne Caruana Galizia. I do believe that the politicians, maybe more than ever before, like Malta doesn't have a history of civil unrest and people taking to the streets. But as a result of what happened in November and December, Clearly, that's something that today is no longer true. I think people will willingly take to the streets, and perhaps the success that the protests that took place in November and December had are a motivator to do that again if necessary. So COVID has given the politicians a little bit of a break in terms of the demands to address the institutional issues. But now that is sort of coming to an end, you can already feel that the pressure is increasing. And if the politicians don't deal with it, I really genuinely think that in the same way as not firing Keith Schembri and Konrad Mitzi back when the news broke out that they had opened secret companies in Panama, remained a noose around Joseph Muscat's neck that he was never, ever able to shackle. This will be the same. I think if it's not addressed by the new administration in a real substantive manner, it'll just remain there for however long this administration stays in office.
Yeah. Okay. I think that provides a pretty good segue into what I'm hoping to be the main topic of conversation for today. We spoke about the previous administration, and one of the actual first initiatives that they came forward with from an economic standpoint when they came into power was the citizenship program, which maybe you'll correct me here. I'm not sure whether it was 2013 or 2014 when it was actually officially put in place. But you've been intimately connected with that through your practice, and I'd love to have a debate with you about the benefits or otherwise of the program, and to maybe use that as a platform to then think about Malta from an innovation standpoint. What measures Malta could possibly take to better innovate in the future. Is there a sense that the innovation that we have done so far has been pretty cynical? But we can get into that a bit later. I think maybe to start things off, I think will be really helpful to listeners who are maybe not completely au fait with the background and the context here, that maybe you can give a bit of background to how this program came about. I've seen numerous acronyms being thrown around, IIP, CIP. Perhaps you can help unpack that as well, and maybe talk a bit about where we are today with the program, and what plan is there, if any, for taking it forward at this point in time from the government's perspective?
It was formally introduced in 2014, although I think publicly it was made public towards the end of 2013, and then there were some forced changes that came about as a result of a reaction from mostly professional service providers to the fact that there was no residency requirement, so no physical presence was initially required. And then there was pushback on that point, and on the fact that there was going to be one firm, the concessionaire, who was going to be the exclusive provider of that service to anyone, which was totally undigestible to everybody in the local professional services.
And this was Henley and Partners, right?
This was Henley and Partners.
Yeah.
And there was big pushback, and then some changes were made, and then it started in 2014. Historically, it was Henley and Partners, I think, that came up with the concept of acquiring citizenship as a result of investment or contributions made to a country. And that was first done in the Caribbean geography, in St. Kitts and Nevis specifically. And since then, many other Caribbean countries have opened up their own programs. And Malta was a little bit of a game changer because it is a European EU jurisdiction. So acquiring citizenship of a European country has a lot more weight than acquiring one of a Caribbean country, which essentially is just a travel document. Whereas being a citizen of Europe allows you, to move freely within any one of the member states and to live there and to work there. So this was a big game changer. Yeah, it was met, I think, with a lot of resistance locally initially. I think a lot of that has waned over the years, but some of that remains. I understand, I think, the tendency to want to push back on an emotional basis on something like this. Citizenship seems something which is very personal, something that you should be born into, something that is part of who you are, and is not a commodity to be traded. So
Right.
I think that's probably the starting point to where a lot of people, why a lot of people are resistant to it.
So wait, so before we get into it, what steps through the program you would need to take in order to get citizenship? Am I getting residency first? Is there a residency requirement for a few years? Can you help unpack that a bit?
Yeah, so there's a few components. One is residency. Yes. You need to become a resident of Malta. You need to spend a limited period of time over a 12-month period in Malta.
And that is residency, and that is residency which is achieved within a 12-month period if you follow the guidance on how long a period of time you need to physically be in Malta.
Law hardwires the minimum length of time for it, for you to go from becoming a resident to becoming a citizen, and that's 12 months. During that 12-month period, you need to have been deemed to do the things that meet the residency requirement. There are a number of things. Physical presence for a period is one. Arguably, it is not a protracted period of time. It isn't physically being present in Malta for 12 months. But one of the things I think was a positive that came about as a result of that initial reaction at the end of 2013 that I mentioned earlier is that some form of physical presence is a requirement. And it is enough physical presence for the applicants, in my experience, to realize that Malta is a country that has something to offer. In the large majority of cases, they would never ever have set foot in Malta before. So it comes as a little bit of a surprise that a country as small as Malta, with such a short history from independence, has advanced so quickly over that period. And they're almost always quite intrigued by it. And so to me, that's a big positive. You know, they're here for a period of time, and they develop a relationship over that period, a genuine relationship with the country. Obviously, these people are international business people who cannot up and leave and spend months on end in Malta or anywhere else, really. So to require that would be to stop the program. So that's one component. The other is an investment in Maltese government bonds, which is something that arguably can be done away with. The demand for Malta government bonds has been satisfied through the domestic market and is always oversubscribed. So I think that's something that probably can and possibly will be changed. Then there is a one-time payment made to the state of at least 650,000 euros, increasing to larger amounts depending on the number of family members.
And that's a cash payment.
And that's a one-time cash payment that goes directly into the government coffers. And then there's a requirement to rent or purchase property and hold that for a period of 5 years. So all in all, it's generally about €1 million.
Let's kind of rewind a little bit and go back to 2014. The program, the rubber hits the road, the program's up and running. How long before the EU, in particular, I'd imagine the European Parliament, gets wind of this and starts making a lot of noise about it? Does that happen immediately, or is that triggered by some other events in Malta that act as a catalyst to kind of reviewing all of Malta's policies?
Well, they were aware of it from the get-go, because as part of the process between the end of 2013 and the beginning of the process of the program in 2014, there was some negotiation with the European Commission. So they were fully aware of it at the beginning. I think it did take a little bit of time for there to be political pushback at the European level as a result of, I think, primarily pressure put on the Commission by the European Parliament.
So there was opprobrium applied to it from the very beginning by the European Parliament. Was that just a huff and puff exercise of just making some statements in the plenary, or did they actually take any further steps than that?
There were a few further steps taken than that, and a couple of reports that were drafted by bits of the Commission as a result of motions made in the European Parliament. But I actually think that the European Union itself is being very short-sighted. Like, I think that the EU itself is missing an opportunity. I was involved in a call a few weeks ago, which was led by the chief strategist and head of asset allocation of one of the larger European banks, an economist of many decades experience. And the second person leading that call was the person appointed by one of the largest EU member states to attract foreign FDI. And one of the points that was made, particularly by the economist, was that Europe is lagging way behind when it comes to FDI. Like, so over the last 10 years, Europe has had more money leaving the region than it's had coming in. Mm-hmm. By contrast with the United States, which has had net positive FDI flow over a 10-year period. And similarly, by contrast with China, who have also had positive net FDI flow over a similar period. And the distinguishing factor has been innovation. Europe has lagged way behind the US and China when it comes to innovation. And the two things that have been shown to attract foreign direct investment more than anything else are, one, innovation, and two, fiscal attractiveness. And Europe has been unattractive on both fronts, right? So money just hasn't flowed here. And what you have here is a relatively small number by comparison to the number of people that become European citizens by virtue of naturalization or marriage or whatever. It's a tiny number of people, but in terms of the number of those people within that level of business society, it's actually quite a large number. And so we have them coming to our doorsteps via Malta, because we're small enough to be able to justify having a program like this, because it has a huge economic impact on us, whereas it wouldn't in Germany or in France or in the UK or in Italy or even in smaller places like Spain or Greece. So we have them coming to our door, and Malta very often is too small for them to make investments large enough to make a difference in terms of their own portfolios or the size of their own businesses. Whereas obviously there are plenty of those opportunities across Europe. And I've been involved in two situations where I've introduced them, some of these people, to the heads of the FDI offices of two of the largest European countries, who are very, very happy to see them and very encouraging of them to come and look at the potential of investing in these two much larger countries. So I actually think that this political bickering, which I think is largely unjustified, can be flipped on its head and become a tool for political bridge building as opposed for creating division.
So what's the main gripe by the European Parliament or the European institutions when they talk about this program?
I mean, I think the main issue that has been at least publicized, and I'm not entirely confident that this is the real justification for pointing the finger at Malta, is due diligence, and it being a backdoor entry for dodgy people to become European citizens, which, yeah, we've partly obviously drawn that upon ourselves as a result of the things that we mentioned in the very beginning of this conversation, which are entirely justified. I mean, looking from the outside in, obviously it doesn't help at all that we've had our Prime Minister forced to resign on the back of such serious allegations. We've had his Chief of Staff forced to resign on the back of allegations that simply will not go away. Another situation which would directly implicated that Chief of Staff in receiving a backhander for somebody involved in this program through another service provider. Yeah. So in that respect, I completely understand, and it's entirely justified for people from the outside to consider this to be to be tied with corruption. But in my experience, it hasn't been the case in my direct experience. And they are not necessarily inextricably tied. So removing the corruption, which partly has been done, hopefully as a result of the removal of those two people from office, is more of a solution to the issue than trying to stop it altogether.
Yeah. So you made a few interesting points there. So when the European Parliament voiced its opposition to the program, you mentioned earlier on that Cyprus has a similar program. Was that a program which came about before Malta's or after Malta's?
I think it was just after Malta.
Okay, and did they receive the same level of dissent from the European institutions, or was that singularly focused on Malta?
Initially, I don't think they did. And I think there was some criticism leveled towards Malta from the US diplomatic channels that I don't think was reciprocated with Cyprus. More recently, I think that's changed, and they have also got the same degree of political scrutiny and criticism that we have. And I think probably the difference that existed initially was as a result of the political issues that Malta had in terms of its governance.
Yeah. And you mentioned countries like Spain. I know that Spain has a golden visa program. So I think while Malta and Cyprus are the only EU countries that are offering outright citizenship for a price, there are a number of European Union countries that facilitate the introduction of individuals into their countries through the payment of cash in some cases. You know, I think in Spain, you have the option, I think, of just paying an upfront payment or buying some property. Same for Portugal, by the way. They've got the same program. And then once you're in, I suppose you're a Schengen resident. So, you know, while you technically don't have a passport, you still have pretty much the freedom of movement within the EU, which is what most of these people are after, right?
The thing I don't understand is this, right? Like every city and country and business is tripping over themselves trying to push out their message to the world to try and attract people to come and consider either buying their product or investing in their city or country. And obviously a lot of that messaging is done over a protracted period of time. There's the world is a big place. It's difficult to put that message across to the right people. There's a lot of noise. So it's a very competitive market that the world is playing in, particularly when targeted towards, you know, the financially successful. In this case, what's happening is largely the opposite. People who would never otherwise have considered Malta are physically coming to Malta, are investing a certain amount of money to obtain a lifelong relationship with Malta. And I have absolutely no issue with that whatsoever, as long as, you know, yes, they go through a rigorous due diligence process, that their, you know, the provenance of their funds is kosher, and that, you know, we as a service provider industry push those people to have a proper relationship with the country, and you can do it over a period of time, and it will come naturally if the country has something competitively good to offer. I have no particular jealous protection over my citizenship.
So I'll stop you on that, because that's a really interesting point, and I want to come to it. But to focus on the FDI argument that you made, you said that getting citizenship in Malta does not necessarily lead to FDI in Europe, simply because Malta itself is not really, you know, investing directly in Malta. There are just limited opportunities for investment, whereas there could be those opportunities on the mainland. Yeah. Why is it that you believe why is it that you think that these individuals need to be citizens of Europe generally in order to invest in Europe? Can't they invest as citizens from outside?
Yeah, you're right. They don't need to be. They absolutely don't need to be. But people have an emotional attachment to whichever region of the world they feel they have one with. And that very often is the starting point to start to look at investment opportunities, which are made initially on the initiative of one or a small number of decision makers in a business. And then obviously, you know, the opportunity needs to go through a process to ensure that it makes financial sense. But you're absolutely right. You don't need to be a European citizen to invest in Europe or to look to invest in Europe, as you don't need to be a Maltese citizen to look to invest in Malta. But it makes a massive difference when the person or the family feel that they have a connection to the place.
And you think that a residency program of up to 12 months, which in principle probably has a nominal, much smaller period of time where you have to actually physically be in the country, is enough to generate that emotional intelligence, and not only to Malta, but actually to some investment in France or some investment in Germany, as if the idea of being a Maltese citizen gives somebody the connection to Europe and wanting to invest in a German power station, for instance.
For a lot of these people, yes, it does. Like, they don't really differentiate between individual member states. It's like looked at as a region as a whole. And I think if there was a system put in place across the EU which brought together the investment opportunities into a portfolio, for instance, and when there are these emotions going through these individuals, when they feel that connection is being made between them and Malta, and as a result Europe, and they're feeling welcomed into this region, if you try and tap into that at that moment in time, then I think there could be huge take up. This is where I think Europe's missed opportunity is. I mean, I've interacted personally with, you know, some of the like most respected venture capitals in the entire world, like some tech founders of multi-billion-dollar US listed tech businesses, with very relevant players in the Asian private equity market, with, you know, some of the most well-respected business people in the Gulf. And this is a very attractive, captive audience that is just going untapped. Now, Malta cannot tap the full potential of these individuals, and I think neither should it. There is an element of Malta using its position in the European Union to benefit as a result of this program more than other European countries are. So I think it's politically fair and even justified for Malta to try to go out of its way to allow the rest of Europe to benefit in some way by pushing investment opportunities in other parts of Europe, and at no cost to us. Like, we're not even contenders in those investment opportunities.
Okay, and so you're saying that the main reason why this program or programs like this are attacked and the government, the parliament in Europe is trying to protect Europe from, is because of this sort of emotional argument that there are these individuals who may be coming from shady backgrounds, want to launder money, and we just can't have them become European citizens. And do you feel like there's a sort of, you know, and I know that you've already touched upon this and it's probably worth getting into now, the emotional element of it is this kind of patriotic feeling or something that gives European politicians a bit more license, a bit more authority to talk on an emotional level about this, because they know that would resonate with the typical European citizen who is very keen to ensure that their citizenship is not diluted by outsiders who don't have any sort of connection or affinity to the country.
I think you see this all the time, both in domestic media and even foreign media, where they attach the adjective dodgy to anyone who happens to be from a particular part of the world, which I think is nothing other than fundamentally racist, or a complete lack of experience in dealing on a personal or professional level with people from those particular regions. And I take offense to that, and I think it's ignorance more than anything else. And that message, yes, that someone coming from Russia or someone coming from the Middle East is dodgy by virtue of that very fact, is something that resonates to populist movements, absolutely, and makes it a very easy message to put across, but it's one that's fundamentally wrong. I've had interactions over the last few years with many individuals from primarily the Middle East and Asia, and to a lesser extent Russia, and that's just simply an unfair statement to make across the board, because I often feel that I share in terms of values a lot more with these individuals than I do with a number of people who are Maltese by virtue of having been born here. And that's probably because many of these people are very international in their mindsets, in their life experience. You know, they're exposed to the best universities that the West has to offer, and their businesses have the best advisors and strategists that come from all over the world to help them make sure they make the right business decisions. And to write them all off as being dodgy just on the basis of them coming from a particular region of the world is so hypocritical and so ignorant, when it comes in particular from the same media houses that profess to be against things which are actually genuinely wrong. Or they might even be the ones holding the anti-racism baton, which is right and absolutely fine. But it is, I think it's very hypocritical to at the same time assume that everyone from a particular region is dodgy on that basis.
Well, I think there is a faction that is talking about dodginess based on where a person is coming from, and I completely subscribe to your view there. But I think there is something else going on here, which is the idea, and especially let's remember that we live in a world where the hot button topic of the moment is wealth inequality, and the fact that there are a collection of haves and a much larger proportion of have-nots in society. And this gap is becoming more and more exacerbated over time, thanks to this kind of late-stage capitalism, corporatism, whatever you want to call it, that is clearly happening, right? And it's something that we need to talk about. And I think that's probably a topic for another day, but a very interesting one. But I think the idea, and I think the nerve that these politicians are managing to touch upon quite effectively, is the idea that citizenship is available to some people simply by virtue of their access to resources that other people do not have. And so that is fundamentally the only difference between people who are successful applicants and people who aren't, assuming all other things being equal from a due diligence perspective. But I think this is really the crux of the issue here. And it seems as though you're saying we should encourage these people to come round. We should accommodate these individuals, no doubt extremely well educated, no doubt very well connected, can open a lot of doors. But aren't we contributing to the facilitation of a world where you've got this elite group of individuals who have access to things that they would otherwise not have access to, but for the fact that they can buy their way into these circles, into these programs, and attain things that they would otherwise have no chance of getting access to?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's not an easy one. It is without argument that. So yes, there are certain people who have privileges or access to things that others don't. But that's the very nature of capitalism in itself. Like, I don't have access to a Ferrari when somebody else who has more money than I do has. Like, is that fair? I have no issue with somebody else owning a Ferrari if they've earned the money to be able to buy that in a kosher way. And what we're saying here is the exact same thing. In essence, okay, there is a sensitivity towards it that is born out of this emotional connection with someone's citizenship, but ultimately the unfairness of it is no different to someone who's wealthy being able to have access to a 5-bedroom home in Mayfair versus somebody who's not wealthy, who maybe doesn't have access to be able to own a home for their entire life. But then it becomes an argument about, is capitalism right? And I think that's not even the nature or the intention of a lot of people who make this argument publicly or in the media. But if you boil it down, that's, in my opinion, that's all it is. Right? capitalism versus communism, by definition, means people have access to things that not everyone else does.
Well, sure. I mean, but we're talking about whether citizenship should be a commodity that can be bought and sold like a Ferrari, right? And there are a lot of people who would suggest that that's not something that should be so easily traded or tradable. And I think there is another reason behind this. I mean, and again, I find myself thinking about the racist factions of society who talk about why we shouldn't allow immigrants into the country. And they're sort of, in some kind of perverse way, making a similar argument, which is we can't have people who have not bought into the social contract that exists between the state and citizens just simply walk into the country and dilute that relationship. So there is an element, I think, here of people feeling, and I'm not saying that this is always rational, right? I mean, we can talk about how irrational these feelings can be sometimes, and they are in many instances quite irrational. But we are talking about here something that is sensitive to people, and the sensitivity, I think, comes from the fact that I've grown up, I've paid my taxes, I take my kids to school, I go to work, I operate within a society and within a system that myself and my father and all my forefathers have been working towards fermenting over hundreds and hundreds of years. And we've sort of established a way to interact with each other and a way of existing and coexisting in society. And I think the sensitivity comes from the fact that some outsider is, either through wealth or other means, is just coming in and assuming that that they can consider themselves to be just as much of a local citizen as somebody who is kind of dyed in the wool in terms of their involvement to the community and so on and so forth. And I think it is interesting for me from a contradictory standpoint, because the same people who are so up against the idea of giving up citizenship to wealthy people have absolutely no problem with immediate access to citizenship for people who actually are not wealthy, right? So people who are coming in as immigrants, economic immigrants, are people who are afforded a certain degree of more of a license from the more liberal parts of society. And I think that this is what I feel is the emotional button here, that some politicians seem to be using to good effect, if not always the most consistent effect.
When it comes to the opposite end of the spectrum, so people coming here on boats from sub-Saharan Africa because they have no resources, I think there needs to be a clear distinction drawn between people who have legal rights as a result of them being asylum seekers or refugees and others, right? To me, there is no difference in terms of rights to be here between myself as a Maltese national and somebody who has a legitimate claim to asylum or has refugee status. Like, there is black on white rights assigned to those people for them to be able to live here. And I think that's until and unless that legislation changes, then there is no point of arguing whether it's right or wrong, or they have the same legitimate right to be here as we do. When it comes to economic migrants, obviously that's much more contentious. And yes, I think a state should have the right to dictate the rules when it comes to the management of the individuals that form part of its community. And I think it's fair that we do, until and unless there is a global system put in place to manage that. Which there isn't currently, and it's unlikely that there will be at any time in the foreseeable future. And I get that, yes, it seems wrong perhaps or unfair to grant the right of access to people contributing wealth versus ones who are not. But I mean, again, I think a state needs to have a strategy on a migration strategy, which at its core is designed to address all the different components of migration that it wants to address in order to manage the makeup of its community, right? So I have no issue with a small component of our migrants being successful business owners from across the world. I think they add a lot of value, both on a societal level, certainly on a monetary level. And if you were to just look at the mathematics of it, it's very, very difficult to make an argument against it. But I think it's equally important to try and attract people of different, like artistic talents or sporting talents. And I think it's important for us as a nation to be open and welcoming to people who are from countries where they're suffering, war or political injustices, and as a result have the right to seek refuge and asylum. And I think we equally need to include people like that. Like that's as a community. It's all of these different aspects of migration that we should be looking to tie together. Like, unless we want to be an entirely insular country, which I, for one, don't want to live in. Like, I think it's one of the most amazing things that happened over the last 15 years. And I remember thinking it the first time I moved back from London was how much more diverse Malta has become in terms of mostly Europeans from Northern Europe and Scandinavia who have made Malta their home. And it's a much more interesting place, I find, to live in than it was 20 years ago. So it really depends who we want to be, I think, as a nation. And I have no issue with having a mix of people of different levels of wealth and different geographic backgrounds all being brought together in Malta as a result of a plan, though. I mean, you can't just open the floodgates and just say, yeah, Malta's open for whoever wants to move here without any sort of controls and restrictions.
But your argument for the program is not a migration argument, it's an economic argument, right?
It's an economic argument, yes, and primarily an economic argument, but I think we're missing an opportunity in not tapping into these people to do more domestically.
Right.
So, yes, I mean, they have very little impact on the local infrastructure. The majority of them won't live here primarily, so they have no negligible, if any, societal impact as well. But they have become an extended part of Malta's diaspora that could potentially be extremely beneficial to Malta.
So the main argument that you're making is an economic one, and sort of to kind of tie it around to what we were talking about at the beginning of the conversation, talking about initiatives for innovation and how the EU seems to be a little bit asleep at the wheel when it comes to innovation. If we were to talk about specifically Maltese innovation, things that Malta can do to innovate, we have had a look at a range of different options. We've looked at different initiatives over, I would say, a 20-year period for ways in which Malta can innovate. I think it started with financial services, and then it segued into gaming. More recently, I'm hearing a lot more about blockchain, although I have my misgivings about our ability to make much of a dent there relative to other European countries. We've got this passport program, which on a net basis seems to have made a lot of sense. I mean, there's pretty much, almost 100% gross profit kind of initiative here, where you've got no costs and all of the cash coming in goes straight into the coffers. But it would be misrepresentative to suggest that this has not come at the cost of our reputation to some extent. And when you add in the other elements that have taken place over the last few years, that have equally, if not more, had more reputational damage on the country. Do you still think that, looking back in hindsight, that this was the smartest way that Malta could have innovated, in light of now knowing what an impact this and other aspects of society, other events that have taken place over the last few years, and we know what those are. Don't we think that perhaps we could have figured out a better way to innovate than wade directly into something that is such a hot button topic and that we knew would get such a negative reaction and response, and still does, from the international community?
Look, if we just take a moment to look at the maths of it, because Malta is so small, it becomes an argument almost impossible to make against it, right? So, like, just to give you a few comparatives, it would take about somewhere between 20 and 30 billion dollars of FDI into Malta to generate the same amount of money directly into the government coffers, right? So that's that through taxation, which is a huge amount. There's virtually no single industry in Malta that comes close to that. Similarly, the amount of money that Malta gets indirectly into its government coffers relative to its GDP would require Germany to create an industry that generates something like $425 billion a year, like for Germany to be generating the same amount in income into its coffers, which is almost equivalent to the German automotive industry. Right.
So the ends justify the means here?
I think that there is virtually no other economic tool available to a government the size of Malta that will generate that sort of mathematics. Now, I don't consider this industry to be one tied to innovation in any way, and I don't think that's what's meant when we use the term innovation. And I think if there is one fundamental flaw that I can criticize the authorities, and I have in the past, is that when they introduced this program, they didn't do it simultaneously with the introduction of a strategy to use that injection of cash to generate real innovation, to create a new substantive industry that would benefit a much wider group of people than this current industry does on its own. And I think that's where the biggest missed opportunity is. So,
similar to how the Middle East did it with oil.
Exactly. That's exactly what I was going to say. Like, if you look to, say, Dubai, or now finally Saudi Arabia has woken up to this reality, these people have, by chance, happened to stumble across reserves of commodities that have an incredible value to the world, completely disproportionate to their sizes, right? Which has made them incredibly wealthy. Now, the smart ones recognize that this industry and those commodities had a finite lifetime, and use those funds to invest in other industries. Like Dubai, is what it is. It has its flaws, but you absolutely cannot but commend the authorities for having the foresight to use what relatively limited resources they had in the context of the wider UAE to build an economy that's based on a number of industries. And I think that's where they can and should be criticized, that this wasn't introduced as a means to an end in itself, right? So this program should not be the end. It should be the means to acquire the end of diversifying our economy, of building new industry. And I would argue in favor of innovation and R&D and tech industry. And that's something we haven't done. And I think that is the biggest flaw. And I think it would be much more difficult for Europe and the European Parliament and the populist movement in general to criticize Malta if that was actively being done. So if this program was being used to attract the Googles and the Microsofts and generate new and attract tech entrepreneurs from around the world, including third country nationals, then it would be much less susceptible to criticism than it currently is, because clearly there is a very justifiable vision, whereas at the moment it's too easily perceived as purely transactional and short term.
And I suppose, we are discussing here ways that it could have been done better, but in the end, the outcome was suboptimal, certainly not from an economic standpoint, as we already discussed and agree on, but there has been a reputational impact to this. It was not handled very well from a PR perspective. And we are where we are partly as a result of this initiative. Just very quickly about you personally. You got involved with this program pretty early on. Your firm did, I mean. Have you felt that there has been a sense of backlash to you personally on a social level as a result of being involved in this? Has it become a frustration for you sometimes to have to defend yourself by probably regularly, if at all, by having to justify your position as to why you're involved in this scheme?
Yes, I've had multiple conversations with people who are of the opinion that it's wrong, or on whatever point of principle disagree with it. And sure
the reasons are the ones that we've already mentioned, right?
Reasons are the ones that we've already mentioned, either purely on the basis of principle or sentiment or emotion, or I think more generally on the assumption that there is no due diligence process, that these people are actually all dodgy criminals trying to circumvent the system and funnel their illegitimate funds through Malta. I actually quite enjoy having this discussion, particularly with people who disagree with me, as long as they're open to having a discussion about it, as opposed to just, the ones who insist that they are right on a point of principle or sentiment, and obviously can't sway those people. I think, yes, probably there are people who have taken issue with it on a personal basis, probably mostly silently. But I don't have an issue with it on a personal basis for all of the reasons I've just mentioned. I think it brings a lot to the country. I acknowledge that there have been reputational downsides, but I put that to the politicians. I think if it had been managed in a different way, the outcome could have been very different on a reputational basis. I think there's also the obvious international political aspect at play, whereas Europe feels that Malta is benefiting off the rest of Europe without getting anything in return. And again, I think maybe Malta's mismanaged that. And one of the things I probably would have done if I was in a position to, is to try and make sure that the rest of Europe benefits as a result of this, at least to an equivalent amount as Malta does, which I think is very, very easily doable. If you look at a number of other industries where other larger European or countries or even the US has had a contention with, it becomes very clear that it is very often an economic argument.
I get the sense from you, though, Luke, that you're discussing things in very much of an economic zero-sum game kind of mindset. And I actually don't think that politicians are making policy decisions exclusively on that spectrum. For example, the fact that we were so welcoming to the gaming community when so many countries were initially super resistant to the idea of it, until they realized that by pushing them away, they weren't actually controlling gambling activity happening in their jurisdictions, and have now kind of reversed tack and have been looking to regulate it. But I think that there is a sense within continental Europe, perhaps less so in the UK, but certainly within the civil law jurisdictions of Europe, that politicians want to make decisions that are not necessarily in the economic interest, but ones that contribute to the sense of values that the country would happen to purport at that moment in time.
Yeah, yes, and I don't think that is necessarily a zero-sum game either. This is just one component of a much broader set of decision-making that a government needs to make in order to make sure, yes, that ultimately its citizens or the members of its community are living in a place that is as good as it possibly can be, not purely from a financial perspective, absolutely. And I am an advocate for moving away from making decisions or policy decisions purely on the basis of GDP, because I think it's an antiquated and incorrect barometer of what should be deemed to be success. But in this case, yes, there are economic arguments to make, and I don't see what the societal negatives are in terms of the impact of people's general well-being. I don't see these people coming and having a negative impact on our society whatsoever. They have a very, very little in terms of the impact on our infrastructure or on our societal infrastructure. It's virtually nil. So there's very little downside in that respect. I think there is potentially a lot more upside. I think they can contribute a lot more to the society in general, but they need to be encouraged to do so, and they need to be given an environment which is not going to destroy them simply for looking to acquire Maltese citizenship through a piece of legislation, which ultimately it was the Maltese sovereign that put into place. So as far as they're concerned, this is a piece of law that was put into place by Maltese legislators, appointed by Maltese voters, entirely above board, and they're simply taking advantage of it. So from their perspective, they're not doing anything wrong. In fact, a lot of them choose to come to Malta versus other places because the threshold is deemed to be the highest, and they want to be put through that diligence process. So I understand what you said entirely, that when I put it down purely to mathematics and to numbers, it may seem that you're making a decision at the cost of values and everything else that a society is made up of. But I don't think it's the case. I just think that's a very strong argument in its favor, and the downside is negligible in terms of the impact on society.
We spoke about the mistakes that have been made in the program so far. Now there's a new opportunity with this new program coming up, and legislation is going to be drafted for it. If you were appointed as an advisor to the government in the drafting of this policy program legislation, what are the things that you would put forward as things that you'd want to see different from the last program?
For me, as I mentioned earlier, the biggest issue is that this hasn't been used as a tool to generate substantive industry. So one of the things I would push for is to ensure that the funds generated by the program, which currently go into something called the NSDF, which has very obscure investment policies, are put towards investments made in a number of pillars, one of which I would argue should be technology and innovation and R&D. Yes, possibly societal welfare issues as well. So not necessarily just industry, but general social well-being. I would also probably replace the requirement to invest in government bonds with a requirement to invest in Maltese qualifying startups. I would probably simultaneously put in place a program that made it very easy for third country nationals who qualify because by virtue of being, for instance, coders or whatever technical background we require in order to facilitate the startup industry, to come to Malta and to become part of our community and to be able to gain access to Malta quickly and easily. And I would use it as a platform to build Malta as an innovation hub, at least for the region. And I find it very difficult for anyone to criticize it, at least in absolute terms, if this were to be done successfully.
Great. Well, Luke, I'm just conscious of the time. We've really overran here, and I didn't really see the time going by. It's been a really fascinating conversation. I really appreciate you coming on and talking with such candor about it. I really feel that this is a discussion that was worth having. I feel that we tend to hear either the government's point of view on things or the opposition, whether that comes from the opposition party or the social community. And I think that there is in the media a high degree of negative bias surrounding this. So I think while I'm not convinced that you may have convinced everybody who had a different view coming into this, I think it's really worth, and I think it's really valuable to have the other side of the argument put forward here. And I certainly believe that through the platform of this conversation, you will have at least opened the eyes of people who might have had a different view, myself included, as to the perspective from somebody who's practicing this day in, day out, who's working much more intimately with this program than the rest of us are. And I think it's useful to see both sides of the picture. And I think you've done a very good job of representing yours.
No, thank you. I think there's value in seeing different sides to the story, as there often is.